Welcome to Now and Xen, the podcast about microtonal and Xen harmonic music of the past, present, and future for JI purists, computer geeks, alternative guitarists, and academic aficionados of all ages, from 8 to 81/64. I'm Sevish.
And I'm Stephen.
And our guest today is Jude Thomas. Jude Thomas is a composer and performer in the New York City area. He has composed several works for the stage, and he's also a barbershop singer who competes in both quartets and choruses, currently singing with Voices of Gotham and winning a championship with the Masters of Harmony in 2011. Jude has also performed the music of American experimental composers, such as Harry Partch's Barstow and selections from John Cage's songbooks. I first became aware of Jude's work during his 31 Days project, where he wrote a new piece of music, in just intonation, every day for a month. Jude now hosts Xen Radio every week on KPISS FM, which features music that explores alternative intonations. I suppose that gives us quite a lot to talk about today. Hi Jude, how's it going?
Hello, I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Cool, yeah, it's good to have you on the show. So I guess to get started, I'd be really curious to hear, how did this all begin for you? How did you get interested in all the weird stuff we talk about?
All the weird stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose there's a sort of a direct path, but maybe it seems circular. I'm not sure. Years ago, when I was doing my undergraduate in music, I was at San Diego State University, and back in the early 70s, that's where all the Harry Partch instruments were.
Okay.
Yeah, and so Harry Partch's main assistant was still working at the university at the time, and he came into one of my composition classes and gave a presentation, and it was pretty cool. I enjoyed it a lot. So then I sort of was doing my thing, doing regular music that you would do in a university. And I would talk to Danley Mitchell, who worked with Harry Partch really closely. That was the instructor. And asked him, how is this thing? And he would sort of brush me off for a while, because I think he had this idea that people didn't really care about the music, and it was just sort of a novelty. And it took a while until I read Partch's book, Genesis of Music. And I said, hey, I have some questions about this book. And he said something, you do really care about this, don't you? After I finished my undergrad, I felt pretty burnt out sort of on music academically. And then that's when I got interested in barbershop singing. And I went into that, and it was then that it sort of clicked for me that this occasional pieces of music that I had been hearing for years, and I couldn't quite put my finger on why it resonated with me, was because it was these super in tune chords and intervals that I was hearing. I just didn't know what was going on. And then getting into barbershop and thinking like, that's sort of it. And then learning more about Harry's music and then building the connection there, which then branched off into other projects and more knowledge. Then eventually I moved over to the East Coast of the United States in New York. And at that time, the Partch instruments were at Montclair State, New Jersey, which is just about an hour's train ride outside of New York City. So I started hanging out there just as like this guy that would show up to hang out, no affiliation with the university whatsoever. But it was pretty awesome. And I got to do a lot of really great things there. Pardon me. And then started getting more interested in just intonation and exploring the possibilities for that with how to compose and how one even does that. And eventually someone who I knew through Harry Partch said, here's how you can do this in Sibelius, which was the music notation software I was using. And then I decided I'm just going to do a huge dive and do this one piece for 31 days. That was pretty transformative as a way to sort of immediately and radically reformat my ears and my thinking and my approach to it. And it's been kind of a steady move since then, doing a lot of barbershop. And unfortunately, the Parch Instruments moved over to the West Coast, so I don't have that outlet. But now getting to work with instrumentalists and other performers out here in New York who are willing to try this crazy stuff with me. That brings us to today, I suppose.
Cool. That is really cool. Yeah, there's quite a few jumping off points there for other conversations. What should we get stuck into? I'd love.
I didn't even talk about the radio show. I forgot about that. But
yeah, you go ahead and talk about the radio show.
Yeah, that was something that just popped into my mind about a year ago. I think there was some chatter on the internet about doing some sort of podcast sort of thing, and I remember, and I thought, oh, that might be a good idea. And I think you guys announced several months before you started broadcasting, and I sent a note to Steven saying, hey, what's the format? Because I'm really trying to do this music thing. And he said, oh, we're not doing that. And I said, okay, good. I don't want to steal your idea because you're pretty far along there. And I was sending out the pitches to both, I guess you'd call legitimate radio stations and underground radio stations in the New York area for about 5-6 months till KPISS finally picked it up and said, yeah, come on board. And they just sort of let me do my own thing. And it's a pretty cool setup. It's in an RV that's in a parking lot in Brooklyn.
Yeah, I saw that. That's such an unusual place for a radio show to be hosted, in an RV.
Yeah.
It doesn't even look like you're in one now. Like, when I look out the window, I just see big cities, and I'm like, oh, he's probably really high up in a building. But
well, right now I am. This is actually not the radio studio. This is
your place.
This is where I go to make money. This is my day job situation, and they have a good recording setup here. So I came and set this up here. And
cool.
That's cool.
But it's and so we started doing that thing, and it's kind of been really interesting process. I'm glad that they picked it up and they sort of let me do my thing and be able to do some flexibility. Like a while ago, you guys just released your episode for the Mercury Tree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right.
And they were in the studio, I think a few weeks or a week after they recorded with you. They happened to come through New York, and we were able to make that work out. Not at my regular time, but I just said to the radio station, hey, this thing's coming along. I need to have a slot at 2 p.m. on a Friday. And they said, let's do it. So it's been really good, and they're really supportive. And there's a Mashable video that just came out that doesn't feature me, but it shows like what this station is, which is kind of funny.
How'd you write that pitch originally for the to try and get Xen Radio? Like, what do you want to tell a radio station and convince them of, basically?
Well, there was two different types of pitches. There's a few radio stations out here that like to do contemporary classical music, for lack of a better term. There's a lot of problems with that phrase. So
yeah,
all you have to do there is sort of name drop and hope that they're not doing things in their catalog. Oh, we're going to do Harry Partch, we're going to do Ben Johnston, we're going to do composers like that. And a lot of their editors and show programmers will know what those names mean. And then there was the more underground radio stations where you just sort of give a rough idea of what you're doing. With the underground radio stations, and this was my experience because I did a radio show in college as an undergrad, and that was just a classical music show, was that everyone's pitching, doing just sort of like indie and underground rock about, oh, I'm going to just play bands that you've never heard of. And so if you just don't make that pitch, you're in. Because they just want someone not making that pitch that's going to be doing something different.
Okay.
Yeah, it's KPISS. Yeah, it's
really
that was
funny.
my thing. Yeah, so just being like, oh, I'm going to do this crazy thing, and the KPISS and Sherry, who runs KPISS, she's like, oh, this sounds fantastic because she's just down for cool stuff. So
yeah, that's
yes.
They do a lot of weird. Actually, most of the station is just kind of strange comedy. Weird comedy shows, and the the person who comes after me, who I hand off to on Tuesday mornings, is he does a lot of interesting comedy stuff, and he plays mostly just whatever he wants, and then he'll do comedy sketches amongst that. So it's a good, that's my pitch when I do it. So far, they were the only ones that picked up on it, so good for them.
Yeah. It's always nice to be able to find somebody who's interested in something new.
Yeah, and it's really nice that they let you play the variety of music that you play on Xen Radio, because I mean it's across all genres really. I've heard contemporary classical music on there. I've heard experimental electronic music. I've heard pop music on there, King Gizzard or whatever. That so many you've played, and the only thing tying it together is just the use of alternative intonations. So it's cool that they went for that.
Yeah, it's actually been an interesting challenge. Coming from the classical background, the challenge for me is to not just turn it into a classical show of doing contemporary classical music that's just intonation. I'm a huge Ben Johnston fan, so I could just play his tracks and Harry Partch for shows and shows and shows. But
Yeah.
one of the good experiences of the show has been the opening up of the different genres and styles that are out there that are taking tuning as some sort of central structural component to the music.
Yeah.
That's really guiding where the music's going and happening. And it's also helped me sort of understand a lot of the different problems in a more personal way. There's a lot of talk online where people are talking about all sorts of things, and that's really important. But getting into the music and exploring it in these different ways has given me another sort of level of appreciation for the different problems that everyone's facing. And that's an interesting thing that your show does, because people are getting an opportunity to talk about these kinds of problems that they're having and how they solve them. And they seem sometimes like these sort of ancient problems where I remember on the Brendan Burns episode where he was talking about why he went with 22 and this interesting idea is like, well, how do you account for the problems of intonation with an instrument that you have to hold in your hands and play that way? And it's sort of been something that people have been struggling with for thousands of years.
Yeah. So folks can listen to our show to find out what all those problems are, and then they can go listen to Xen Radio to hear the end result of all of those struggles.
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And it's really good that we have all of these different kind of things bubbling on in the Xen harmonic community that people can go in and check out.
Yeah, the Brendan Burns is a real interesting example. I only recently learned about him after the Mercury Tree came on the show.
Oh, really?
Because the show they came on, I asked them to do the playlist for the show, with the exception of a couple tracks which from their album that they just put out, and said, "Hey guys, do the playlist. I want to know what you guys are listening to. I want to know what inspired you." And I had not heard of Brendan Burns, which is interesting. And they played a track from the 11's album. And we talked about his work. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting, which ended up opening up this whole new landscape of artists who are working in a similar sort of way. This kind of, this pop music that uses tuning, pop music. I mean, it's weird. I do a lot of my stuff on Apple Music, and it's funny to see the genre classifications that they stick on some of these things. Makes me laugh. But similar artists, and that's been a good expansion of the show. I never really worry about whether I'm going to run out of music, but my biggest worry is to sort of get into a situation where each episode sort of ends up being a clone of another episode, but with different artists and tracks just sort of plugged in to exactly the same formula. And then the sort of overall show-to-show feeling becomes really stagnant. I don't think there's an end to artists to find out there and an end to tracks to find out there, but
absolutely
finding a way to keep the playlists really fresh and interesting and and at the same time have a sort of connection and through line that goes through the entire show is pretty important. That's where a lot of the work comes in off the air.
Yeah, I can imagine that's very challenging to kind of create that, having tracks kind of seg into each other in a meaningful way, in a musical way, when they do all share aspects of tuning that they're using, but maybe stylistically very different. But that also makes it quite exciting, I think, and just makes it a good variety for people that are tuning in.
Yeah, it's about, I'd say, like hour and a half to 2 hours of work per show off the air to do that. And because it's not a major source of income for me, I get into this situation where I have to plan maybe like 5 or 6 shows out at once when I have the time to sit down and go through things and go through all the cues of tracks I've saved and flagged and all sorts of things. Then going back to previous shows to see, have I played anything by this artist recently? Because I don't want to play too much by the same artist unless it's a themed situation. So like through all of June, I've been doing the Veli Kujala's hyperchromatic counterpoint, like opening every show in June with a different section from that. For people who haven't heard it, it's a quarter tone accordion piece, and it's pretty wild, and it's really interesting. And that's been kind of my theme for the June month, is every show opens with this track, and then I'll be taking early July off because I'll be off at the Barbershop Harmony Society convention there, and I just won't have time to do anything. And then I'll be back in mid-July, so I'll be pretty soon jumping into planning out kind of July and August shows at that point.
So what do you, or how do you feel about Barbershop that uses a lot of different singers? Because I've seen Voices of Gotham. It was more than just 4 singers, like Westminster and how they do it.
There is a little bit of a debate in the community about quartets versus choruses, and I'm one of those people that when you get that chord locked in and ringing like crazy, it's like a drug.
Yeah.
It really feels like it's like you're getting intoxicated by the feeling and the sound of it. So there's things choruses are able to do in locking and ringing chords that quartets cannot do unless you have incredibly good singers.
Okay.
So I would say that with the chorus, there just needs to be less individual contribution from each individual, so everyone's able to support each other in different ways, and you're able to also get louder. And it's a different kind of sound too, and it's easier to get sort of a higher fidelity in the chord, but if I were to hold one against the other, is like the most in tune ringing chord from 4 guys or from 40 guys, I would say I prefer the one from 4 guys, and that's definitely more of a rush to be singing in a quartet and get that experience from the quartet. But I think they're both really valuable contributions to the style, and they've allowed the chorus singing especially has allowed for a different kind of thought about what more of these in-tune chords can be and how they can be used. I don't know. This isn't super consciously discussed among barbershoppers, which is odd because it's such a self-aware genre among its practitioners. But the chorus experience has allowed for the style to perpetuate itself in a lot of ways, because you don't need to be at the same level as a singer in a chorus that you need to be in a quartet to participate. And as an art form where the audience is almost entirely people who also participate, so when you go to one of these conventions, everyone's there because they do barbershop. It's very much it's kind of like a business trip when you go to a convention or a conference. It's not a spectator sport, even though the quartet, the highest level of quartetting, there's obviously a small minority of the people participating in that because of what quartets are. But the chorus stuff has allowed people to participate at a very high level, and a lot of people to participate at a high level and stay involved in that. So it's a really important part of the style.
I'm just wondering, what is it about the chorus that makes it easier to hit that ringing chord?
Well, it's a challenge to sing in tune, and it's a challenge to do that effectively because it involves a lot of not forcing the pitch into place and just kind of relaxing. And if you're not a really trained singer who spent a lot of time learning how to be very relaxed while singing, the tension that one has in the body will get in the way of that.
Okay.
And it prevents the ears from doing the work that they need to do, which is just finding those overtones and locking into them.
Yeah.
So with a chorus, because you're not holding 100% responsibility for the part you're singing, you have the luxury of not singing as hard or as loud or as putting much effort into it.
Yeah.
So many people can put a very little amount of effort to achieve that, and especially with a large group, if a few people start locking in on the right thing, and the other people can sort of jump onto that.
Right.
Like hear that, like, oh, this person's correct, I'm going to sing what they're singing, instead of in a quartet where if you're singing it wrong and you're not able to make that correction, then unless you just happen to fall into where the pitch is, then it's going to, you're never going to get there unless you start doing, until someone says like, no, this is what's right, and then you just duplicate that.
Oh, okay.
It's like you have only yourself to listen to in the quartet, and you have to sing louder. I've always wondered about that because I've been to barbershop camp, and I know the culture a little bit. I respect how hard it is because I have a really hard time singing loudly and accurately. I can sing medium and very accurate if I'm doing that, but yeah, it's definitely hard to like project and like really make sense with everybody else. And vowels play a big part in the tuning too, right?
Oh yeah, well, as I've been more experienced in this, I realize that so much of doing it right is getting things out of the way so that your ears can do the work that they need to do. So, and getting in tune and staying in tune. In my quartet rehearsal just recently, we've been figuring out, it's like, oh, well, we have to say the word what, and the note changes, and if you break down the word what, there's an ooh what in there, and we have to decide, well, is the ooh going to be on the previous note or the next note, and we have to slide and turn the vowel together and move notes at the same time, because even if we're completely locked in on the previous chord, as soon as the vowel gets out, it becomes more difficult for our ears to hear what each other's doing. And then it goes out briefly, and then we move through this moment where there's kind of it's just not as tight. And we get into the new one, and then we have to adjust to get back in tune, and it takes a split second to do that. So it's the vowel is again about making sure that we can just hear each other, so we can know to what we need to do to stay in tune with each other. It's so interesting because it's so much about trust and being certain about what the other people are going to do, and that you need to do the same thing at the same time. That's an interesting thing about quartetting that is not so much with chorus, because you're 100% responsible for your own part. There's so much like trust that you need to have among the three other people in your quartet.
Right.
That's one of the things I really love about it. And the best quartets, which I aspire to be one day, is they can do the same thing every time. And for an a cappella voice on its own to have that precise level of intonation so consistently every time is so difficult because as a quartet member, it's like, oh, I'm going to sing this part of the chord and that part of the chord. Regardless of how sharp or flat it is, I just know like this is where it's right. If the other people in the quartet aren't doing the same thing every time, then I need to be changing every time. So
yeah.
the certainty falls away, and hearing those groups do it so well at the competitions is fantastic. It's like there's sort of like a groove that they've kind of locked into, and they're like inside a slot of tuning that's happening, and it's a pretty phenomenal experience. And like I said, it's like an addictive drug.
Yeah. Do you think that sort of addictive drug feeling has to do with your interest in just intonation? Like, do you feel like non-barbershop JI has that quality for you generally, or?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And this is a thing in barbershop culture that a lot of people talk about this addictive drug quality. And which is why like it's not uncommon among barbershoppers to be interested in music that does like JI and that sort of thing. There's a lot of the guys from Voices of Gotham have come to concerts of mine, and they're like, oh yeah, that's the stuff. Like they can tell really easily like what things are doing, even though I'm exploring stuff that's way beyond what we're doing in the barbershop context, like very high limit or higher limit, just intonation, and they'll hear it. They're like, yeah, that's it.
That's interesting.
Like they'll like,
do you think there's a place in barbershop for higher limit sonorities, such as the 11 and 13 limit, or is it too far away from that traditional sound?
Well, the 11 limit is starting to creep in here and there.
Really?
Little bits, yeah. I mean, this is something that connects back to Parch, and the 11 sounds a lot like a sharp 11. Like even though it's fully just a quarter tone off, when you hear it like in that chord, if you just had the major chord and then you play the 11 and it's ringing, it's like it sounds like a sharp 11. You don't really think of it as like, oh, it's a quarter step, and you can learn that conceptually and then hear the difference between that and what would be closer on the piano, but when you hear it, it's like, yeah, that's a true sharp 11 happening there. Where the 13 doesn't really quite have that analog in the traditional Western scale. It's kind of its own beast. It's like, I remember when I was first exploring this and when I was in my early times, like doing this and like playing these things, or doing a situation where you like sing a drone and then move your tongue around in your mouth to like bring out certain partials, and I would move up and down the overtone series to hear that, and you get to the 13 and I was like, am I hearing a major 6 or am I hearing a minor 6? And I just couldn't decide, and my brain would keep flipping back and forth between those, where with the 11 it was always here's a sharp 11, like that's a sharp 11. It's like I know that it's super flat according to what the piano says, but so you'll hear that, especially because the dominant 11 chord is starting to come into barbershop, kind of around the periphery here and there. So when it does get sung, it's people are using that sharp 11, the 11th partial to do that, and it's always been sort of on the kind of the sort of outer ring of repertoire, where like the sort of way jazz has creeped in, or there's a lot of recreational singing in barbershop where people will just go to bars and just get up in a quartet and just sing things and teach the parts by ear to the other people. And there's a lot of those kinds of chords have been there for quite a while. So
whenever I'm thinking of the chord with the 11th partial in it, I also think of the major chord, like in 12-tone equal temperament, sort of the analog, and how often it's used in like Debussy, or how often people will connect it with the whole tone scale. Like if you're thinking of, say, C, E, G, B flat, D, F sharp, if you just take out the G, you're pretty close to a whole tone scale, but structurally in just intonation, that locking and ringing chord really is nothing like it, but harmonically it sounds very similar. So those connections are really interesting. I also hear the 13/8 as not really being as like listener friendly, I guess. Although it does always sound like a minor sixth-ish to me. It doesn't even really sound like that remarkable. I don't know. It's like the 11/8 is like really, like it really catches your ear and draws it in, and then 13/8 just kind of sounds like a minor sixth that's a little bit higher. And I don't think the lock and ring is as easy to hear.
Oh, that's definitely been my experience. Although my experience in hearing it has always been like it's kind of its own thing, that it's just sort of, there's not really a analog in Western music. But
right,
when you start using the 13 with those other lower limit notes in music, the ringiness is really, really interesting. And what you bring up about the whole tone scale is interesting as well, because I've recently been experimenting with a sort of just intonation whole tone scale that just goes through the, which is just the, like 1-1, 9-8, 5-4, 11-8, 13-8, 7-4, and then up to the octave again, and just only using those partials and seeing like, oh, what kind of like whole tony things can you get out of that? And you get these really ringy chords, but there's no fifth in there or the 3/2. So the kind of, it's not super ringy, because when the fifth is there, that's kind of what I like to call the heart of the ring.
Yeah,
it's so in tune, and it just brings so much resonance to the sound. But when you pull it out, there's a lot of interesting things too in like voicings, how you voice the chords.
It's really important. Yeah, like 11 limit and 13 limit stuff mostly needing to be high in the voicing. Like if you make it too low, or if you put it in, I guess, the harmonic series chord in the inversion when the 11/8 is like really low, it's just not going to sound as in tune, I guess.
Yeah, that's been my experience. I found with these kinds of chords, your best hope is to have really wide spacings or really high and tight spacings.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's like you're just basically cramming everything in sort of the traditional kind of soprano range, like cramming all these seconds in together, or really spreading it out and using a lot of like wide, like seventh and sixth spacings to do that, to get that sound in there. One interesting sound is actually if you just do the sound of the seventh partial and then the 13th partial above it, like I guess it would be Voices of Seventh on the staff, but that kind of thing. If you just have those alone there, that's a pretty ringy sound in and of itself. And then if you were to do a dominant chord that's just like root, and then the seventh, and then the third, and then that 13 on top there, that's an interesting sort of open sound at the same time. Otherwise, you have to like keep everything really tight. Otherwise, it gets very muddy. Yeah,
absolutely. I heard a piece that somebody did for choir once. I think they were presenting about it, where they had done the exact voicing like that you had mentioned, a seventh and then another seventh, but their second seventh wasn't the original note to 13/8 in whatever octave it was. It was a 7/4 off of that second note. So like two chains of 7/4s. And I should compare them and see if they sound different. I wouldn't know how different those sound off the top of my head right now. Probably not too different. Maybe just a little bit.
I think there's a Ben Johnston piece where he did that, where it's just a lot of 7 limit tuning, a lot of those 7/6 minor thirds in there, which are actually very easy to sing because they fit right into the overtone series. I've found that that's my sort of go-to minor third. If I were to just pop one out, like, oh, sing a minor third, it'd be like that one.
Yeah,
really. Oh, cool.
I have that same experience.
Makes sense.
And then the actual, like, what we think of as the 6/5 minor third is a little trickier to get for me, because it's I don't know. I'm not quite sure. It doesn't have that same sort of like quality of like less ringiness.
Right.
I keep using that phrase, but
yeah,
I don't know how else to call it.
Yeah,
Well, actually, we've been talking about just intonation. We've been talking about ringing and ringing chords. I'm wondering if it's worth us explaining to the audience actually what that really means from a theory perspective, and then maybe even from a just intonation perspective. You know, how microtonalists would explain that.
Oh yeah, the simplified version. We always try and like have beginner-friendly versions of things in our podcast, like in the middle of the episode after they're already scared away. So
yeah, for me, it's been about the overtone series, and then finding the ways to use pitches that are also in the overtone series of another pitch that's sounding. I don't know if I have a very simple way of putting it, because I find there should be a word for that. Whole number ratios, which is often the description when you go on Wikipedia or anywhere. It's like, oh, just intonation is music that uses whole number ratios,
or like rational numbers.
Yeah, and
simple ones.
I've always felt that kind of like skipped a step, which was like, well, there's this other thing that's going for it, and we just found out that whole number ratios are kind of the best way of talking about it.
Yeah.
There's this goes back to Parch and his use of whole number ratios, because the more you get into this and you get into other forms of microtonal music, I find that the traditional musical staff and notation really starts to fall apart and becomes less and less useful for even dealing with this kind of music. And there's been some really good and beautiful hacks that people have used to keep it working.
Right.
But it's why Parch just kind of threw the whole thing out and just started using ratios
and tablature and yeah, fascinating.
And so I was telling some friends the other day about Mercury Tree and saying, oh yeah, they use these 17 note things, and my friend said, well, how would they even do that? And I'm like, well, for the guitars, you'd just probably do tablature if you're not just teaching it by ear.
Yeah.
And they can talk about how they do it, and you can listen to their podcast episode about how they do it.
That's right.
But it's just there's no real hope with notation. A friend asked like, oh, what about keyboards? And I was like, well, you could do notation on keyboard, because it's just telling you which key to press down for which time, which is what Parch does for Chromelodian. But you have to be prepared for it not to sound like that. And if you're trying to teach things by ear, then it's not going to work. People have to be ready to sort of throw out their expectations of what keyboards should sound like. When the Mercury Tree visited the show, we chatted about this, the feeling, there's all this talk about like, oh, math and microtonality and how, whether it's good or bad to do that. But I say there just doesn't seem to be a better way to talk about a lot of the things that we're talking about without having to go into some really, really long expectations, that it's a really convenient way to describe what's happening. And
yeah, it's really important. I kind of have a little soapbox with this, where maybe I get a little bit upset that people are anti-math, because it doesn't, like, they wouldn't use that same logic with other things that they use. It's like, we're just describing how the system is constructed, so of course we need to use math to talk about that. Like that there are 12 notes, Do you find that fact offensive that we said that there were 12 of them? Now we're talking about math already.
I know, so. It's interesting. Well, I'm all for them making a better way of talking about it. If it is better, I have no problem. And I think there's a lot of really good ways that people are exploring this. So, there's like color notation and it's an important discussion that's going on. And
with just intonation, and some equal tunings and other things. Like, I think a lot of equal tunings are pretty easy to notate. 17 and 19 and 31 and 24 are particularly easy. And then some other ones require a bit more logic, but are still pretty graspable. Like, I am going to make a video soon about 2 really important ways to notate 15, because there's kind of 2 really good ways to do it.
Yeah, I'll be interested in seeing that when that comes out, because I don't do a lot of equal tuning stuff, mostly because I'm working with computers mostly in my composing and then the times I work with live live instrumentalists and humans, they do their best. And when the notation I give them, I use the Helmholtz-Ellis. It's a really elegant system that's based upon using the harmonic series, which is super useful for what I'm doing. And there's no way I'm going to try and reinvent the wheel on that. And I had a good experience a while ago where I gave a score to some musicians, and I was still using ratios in that, and they had no idea what was going on. And and I asked them, like, well, what would be helpful? And they're like, can you just put cent deviations above these? And I was like, oh yeah, sure. And then I sort of gave up on ratios, at least on the scores. I need to use them for my own work and comprehension. And once you get the right people and get them to, once they realize that, oh, I just can hear all this stuff, then that's what sort of gets them through the work. I had a good experience a while ago working with a string group, and they were a lot of groups get really scared when they see the score first. I'm like, oh, what is this? And I said, like, look, you're going to hear all these things. It's going to be fine. Just trust your ears.
Yeah.
And we're going to have a really rough first few hours, but once we get through that and you realize that you can hear these things, then it's going to start popping in, and it does. And it's really good. I've been super lucky to work with people who've been willing to even try this stuff. If you get past the point where someone's willing to try it, then you're kind of like 90. Nuts, right? Yeah. Then you're 90% of the way there.
Right. Yeah. Do you ever provide guide tracks?
I do. But I've found that they don't often get used, but I always do provide that.
Interesting.
For them. When I work with vocalists, and I tend to like sort of draw on barbershoppers in that respect, because they're able to hear things more quickly and memorize the sound of an entire chord. That's a pretty like critical thing for working with this kind of music, is that you have to not so much know your part, but know what your part contributes to the entire sound, so you can make those adjustments. And that's something that barbershop singers have really learned how to do, is like, what is the whole sound I'm hearing and what's my contribution to that? So then I'll send them things, but generally I make them and I provide them, but I find that they don't get used, which is okay, because you're going to have to sort through those problems in rehearsal as well. So, and there's a lot of sort of non-musical factors that get into that, like how much you're paying the musicians and how much time they have, and what does everyone's life look like.
How much do they like the music?
Oh, they tend to like it. Yeah. That's a big thing. Yeah. If they're willing to try it, then there's a really good chance that they're going to like it.
Yeah.
And they kind of, they're professionals, they don't understand that it's not how much they like the music isn't really important. They just understand that they have a job to do, and they're going to get in and do that. And I've had mixed experiences, and frankly, it's not always like about like whether it's in these weird tunings or not. It's the personality of the people, connecting with them, being really like supportive and nice, and generally not being like an asshole to them.
Right. Just don't be a jerk, because like if you let them know that you're not like an X-Acto knife, or like trying to making sure they have to be really on, or it's not going to be right, as long as you let them know that that's not the case,
Yeah, and it's funny because like one rehearsal I was at a while ago, we started, they're like, oh, do you care if we're in like A442? And I'm like, no, I don't care. But it's like, I just can't care about that stuff. And it's like, oh, is this, you're like, do you have perfect pitch? I was like, not at all. I do not have perfect pitch.
Cool.
Don't worry. Don't worry about that. It's just like, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine. It's like, I can just tell you if the chords are right.
I'm just going to start pretending that I don't have perfect pitch for those situations, so that people will just play how they normally play.
Yeah. I wonder if there's more potential for what you might call perfect pitch, because I remember doing my ear training. I went really hard into ear training a few years ago just to like refresh myself. And one of the things I found, and I need to go back and do this, is that I would just constantly like hit a tuning fork and put it up into my skull so that it really rang. And then just in a few weeks, I had that A memorized. Like I could just crack it out. And it was interesting steps where like I could mime the movements and then it would come back as a memory. And if
you probably have what I have.
Yeah, and it's at some point then you're like, okay, you got the A down. So then if you just know your intervals at that point, you can get anything else from. And that was what my instructor was telling me. He's like, oh, I just have the A. He's like, I just worked really hard to get that A. And then I'll just get anything else from that. So that's like, so probably everyone has this sort of potential for perfect pitch. And I mean, it's interesting and you bring this up. It's like, oh, you didn't learn it as a child, so it's not perfect pitch. It's like, did you just learn to remember it as a kid? Is that the criteria, that the age that you remembered it at? Because that's interesting. That doesn't seem like it'd be important.
Yeah, I don't know. It definitely has to do with those early formative years. So, my parents, like my mom had played music, but they weren't really like, musicians on a professional tier. So they wouldn't have known how to explain that information to me. So, yeah.
There's a few guys in Voices of Gotham who have perfect pitch. And one of the funny experiences was we were working with them on a group. And one guy, I looked at one of them and I said, oh, can we just have that E flat again? And he sang it. And the other person looked at him and said, really? That's what it is? So someone was perfect and someone wasn't. I'm not sure who was, but it was funny to see them get in this argument over
which E flat was the right one. Yeah.
Whether it was, and everyone else in the room was like, well, we don't know what E flat actually sounds like in our heads. So we're going to,
I wonder
one of you better be right.
Oh, maybe I can sing it right here. Do that sounds pretty close.
Yeah, we'll check it in post, I guess.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I'll play an E flat like on the show to see if I'm close at all. So we won't know until the show comes out, I guess.
Yeah, I hope it's something just between E and E flat. That's my hope.
I'll bet the one I sang was the hair low. Do 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 do.
Okay.
I'm thinking about it now. Well, the thing is, microtonality does great things to your perfect pitch.
Yeah.
And like, you sort of are thinking about gradation a bit more. And I'm like thinking about different E flats that I could try, and like which ones are reasonable as E flat and which ones aren't.
Mm-hmm.
And I am thinking in my head, like, okay, I'm gonna go down a little bit. Oh, that's starting to sound like a D, so that's not really. And like, I'm thinking I have to go up more to get to something E-like, so it's probably low. We'll see.
All right. I'm hoping for a good septimal E flat. That's that natural seventh of the F.
A 7 over 6. From C, or a 7 over 4 from F. Yeah. I
live in the Harry Parch world of G equaling
G equaling 1.
Yeah, that's my thing. But as I've gone more lately, as I've been doing more of the Helmholtz-Ellis notation, it's kind of opened up a more kind of expansive way of thinking about the pitch spectrum that hasn't been grounded in necessarily any sort of given 1-1, but rather like a more sort of flexible space where all these pitches exist, which has been really good, because using ratios, when you have 1-1 as a fixed spot, it kind of controls your compositional process, because you don't want to get into more complex ratios, because then it's just like, oh god, I gotta multiply numbers that will get into the thousands, and I'd just rather not do that for obvious reasons.
I wonder if any composer has decided to use, or like creatively use transfer in order to re-notate ratios with a different one. I've always wondered about this. I thought it would be really convenient, because of course with just intonation and potentially modulating with lots of different ratios away from the 1/1 key, like there's tons of exciting potential there, and you've got lots of intricate compositions with Helmholtz-Ellis where you sort of go out of key a lot and the notation is really crazy. So yeah, I guess I'm wondering if anyone has ever gone quite a bit out and then renotated some other stuff with a different 1/1. It seems like that would be the best way to deal with it. You probably wouldn't really need to call that transfer, though, if transfer is changing the tuning system.
That's interesting. So I guess if you're doing tonal music with key signatures, you could just solve that with key signature changes and then be like, okay, this is the new 1/1.
Oh yeah, those two ideas could kind of merge together, which is fascinating since, starting with 1/1, often with simple notes, doesn't really give you all a major scale unless you're using 5 limit.
Yeah, so that's something to consider. I don't use key signatures in my writing.
I know why you wouldn't.
Yeah, it's what the Helmholtz-Ellis offers is that there's a lot of ways, like I said, to sort of move flexibly within the space, and I try to definitely not have to have too complicated accidentals, because working in notation software, you have to design that accidental, and that's still kind of time consuming, and you have to think about the relationship between that and other things. And my first drafts and a lot of my early work, I just do all by hand because it's a lot faster and easier to conceive and move that way. And then I do the editing, usually in a notation software or some other DAW or DAW or whatever they get called these days.
A DAW.
Yeah, DAW.
Not really.
So but finding a way that it's interesting, because switching the notation and going from ratios, it really helped me realize how much these methods and tools I were using constrain my own thought and imagination, or guide it in that sense. That's something I've been thinking a lot about as a composer. And sometimes it's very difficult to see that those things are even occurring. There's kind of like an ideology of process that controls your thought when you're working on the music, and that the tools that you use are so connected to one's imagination and both expand and limit the potential that we each have as we create and envision the works that we're making.
So with the Helmholtz-Ellis notation, is it a situation where you say you can move around within the space? Is that because the accidental system is so well built that you can sort of move into really, really complex ratios without actually having to think about and write most of them? Is that sort of the situation there?
Well, because
that seems like it would be ideal.
It's close to that, because you can move into more, for lack of a better term, complicated scenarios, and your accidentals that you use will expand and get more difficult to decode. But what's the advantage about it is that because it's so connected to limits and the overtone series, there's no sort of set C being 1/1 or G being 1/1. There's just your basic accidentals are all just in a Pythagorean tuning system, and then you use You use little modifications to add the 5 limit, and then you add an extra symbol to add the 7 limit, and then additional symbols for each sort of limit thereof. And it's pretty well expressed that way. So you have if you have a D on the stave, then you'll have you could put a 5 limit F sharp above it, or if you wanted to, you could put an 11 limit A beneath it, which just looks like the reverse flat symbol, and it's just allowed for that, so that it's not really if you were using Parch's system, instead of having to constantly map it onto a fixed system of ratios.
Right, because doing math in your head as a musician for the first time with those ratios is very, very unintuitive thinking, since it takes so long. So people who are fluent in JI are people who know how it works and kind of have their ratios sort of memorized offhand, like how you would have to memorize your intervals in 12-tone equal temperament. It's really just the same thing. It's just that there's a lot more of them, and now there's a numerical reason for them to sound that way. Whereas before it was just here, this sounds good for no reason.
And the ratios are really important
So-
to understand, but yeah, it's ancient. I feel like the octave is a real universal that seems to
Yeah, for sure.
to transcend culture, but there's a lot of interesting exploration about the with non-octave tunings that is that I have not put my head much and my ears into listening, although I've been starting to listen to a lot more of those Boole and Pierce tracks now that I've been doing the show, is like exploring those. And I haven't I wonder if we're still conceiving of that music in a world with octaves. Like that's still, the thought is still governing our experience of the music. I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. There was a really good I'll call back to another episode of yours when you were talking to Elaine Walker and the problem of transposing melodies by the octave in Boole and Pierce, and it just totally falls apart. And it was a real interesting thing to think about.
It is tricky, though.
Yeah, I guess you guys have had more experience working that than me. But what is this? How does it really just not work when you were just pop the melody into a different octave?
I think we both just done one thing in Boole and Pierce. I think that is correct for maybe I'm getting yours wrong, Sevish. Maybe you've done more than one thing. Maybe like 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I've done a few things in Boole and Pierce, and I like I said on the Elaine Walker episode, I think it's definitely true with sub bass, because I think the octave is so important for the lower registers. So for that reason, I do suspect that our perception of the octave does govern what we're hearing, even when we listen to Boole and Pierce music, because we're expecting that octave to be there. In fact, sometimes we're using instruments that have the octave, obviously as the first overtone, and we're hearing that kind of timbre and tuning kind of combine. But even if you make music with just square waves and clarinets and play Boole and Pierce music, these are timbres that have only odd harmonics in them. I still kind of can feel out a little octave in there. I don't know. But if someone said,
absolutely,
I've been listening to Boole and Pierce music for the last year, and I've been blocking out all other music, and now I can hear tritave equivalents, I might be willing to believe them. But we need to do a lot more investigation into this. I think it's just so difficult where we all grow up in cultures that have octaves, like literally all over the world. Octaves there.
Yeah. Löis, Lancaster. He does a lot of really interesting stuff in that tuning, and I have albums of his that I'm listening to right now to get onto the show. There's a spot that he hits that has not really been hit yet on my playlists, and that'll be interesting. I'll keep my ears open to that, because he does some really wild stuff that's kind of at the highest level of writing that's very perplexing and super fun to listen to. I remember he won the UN12 competition back in 2012, and I did a piece. I did a piece for that, and I remember I was bummed that I didn't win, and because I'm competitive, so I like to win, and winning is better than losing. But anyways, I heard his album. When I heard it, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to listen to the winning track, and I listened to it. I'm like, oh yeah, that definitely deserved to beat me. There's no way that this is I'm not anywhere near this. This was so far beyond what I was making at the time. I was like, this is, I would feel bad if I had won and that one did not win, because it was so good. God, I wish I could remember the name of it. Anyways, it's free for download on the UN12 website if anyone wants to go check that out, because I was blown away by his production quality is ridiculous as well. For what he's doing, which is really amazing that he's able to put that music together. And there's obviously a lot of great imagination happening in his own work. I'm excited to get him on the show sometime. Well, not. I
Yeah.
wish I could have him as a guest, but maybe if he comes to New York, I'll say like you need to come by. But like having his music, because I haven't had it yet, but I'm excited to get some of it on the air.
And we can talk about some of your tracks too.
I tend to not put my music on the show, mostly because I don't have a lot of the good production quality. That's actually the top thing for getting onto the program for Xen Radio is like, what is the production quality? And then generally like, is it okay? And unfortunately, I have to decide whether it's okay or not, because the production quality is an easy decision. That's pretty obvious. So,
yeah.
And then, that's actually the big challenge, because there's a lot of people doing good stuff that they're putting on their SoundCloud, but they're just not the best produced tracks, unfortunately. And it's sad to say that that's more of a problem of sort of money and access to facilities than anything else. But and then like later, it's like I said, getting into the quality of the track, how well it balances with things, how much have I played certain things. When Mercury Tree sent me their playlist, I was bummed because they had a track that I had just played the week before. I said, "Oh, sorry, I played that on my last show, so let's do something else." And it was a bummer because it was like such a good choice. It was Micro Steps. It was like by Dave something.
Kuzinski?
Yeah, and it was like, and I just found that one too and was played it. I'm like, wow, this is really good. And when they suggested it, I was like, oh, sorry, we just played that, so we'll do something else. But yeah, those are the main categories for getting on the show. Is like, is it good? Is the production quality well? How well does it balance with other things? Where have I been sort of like heavily invested? Does the show have a particular theme? I don't do a lot of themed shows, but I've done a couple. Like early in the set, I did like it's all pianos. I did a show early that was like the 4th episode. It was all pianos. So that was an interesting situation where it was like this, a lot of Harp of New Albion was in there for Terry Riley, which was really good to get into.
I love that one.
Wizengrodsky, some of his quarter tone pieces, which are really interesting. The Charles Ives quarter tone piece.
Yes.
Aaron Johnson, he had a piece on there that was off of the Beyond 12 album that was recorded by Aaron Calais, I think. And there's also a Kyle Gann piece on there. And
was it from Hyperchromatica or a different one?
I think that was is that the record label?
Well, Hyperchromatica was Kyle Gann's most recent CD. That was like for Disclaviers. Really 3 pianos tuned in JI a lot of different ways.
Oh no, I don't think it was that. Let me look up the playlist here. The Kyle Gann piece was Echoes of Nothing.
Oh yeah.
And the Aaron Johnson piece was Ostinato Quasi Octatonica.
Yeah.
So I think those were off the same album, which was the I think it was called Beyond 12. I just feel like that's a name for like too many microtonal projects.
Right, that's like the generic microtonal name.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were actually just talking about that album on our John Schneider episode, or our Parch Ensemble episode. So that was pretty neat. I didn't know that Aaron Johnson had something on that. So
yeah, I was surprised.
Really quick. Yeah.
I remember looking up and I'm like, I know that name from somewhere. And it was like, oh yeah, that was it. Parch is another thing I have not featured much on because I'm planning on the future of doing like a really proper Parch episode in the future. So I've held back on programming more of his music on the show.
Yeah.
But the John Schneider's Ensemble just released a new album of first, I think it's Sonata Dementia of
well, that's actually and then June 28th and June 29th they're gonna perform it at some place in California. So
fantastic.
Yeah, we talk about it on that episode, which is awesome. We can promote it twice.
All right.
But yeah, you know what I really think is so like amazing about Löis Lancaster and the way he writes in Bull and Pierce is how coherent he makes the chord progressions sound somehow. It's like when you listen to atonal music, or not atonal music, but I guess music that has a repetitive structure but really strange chords. You know, something like Messiaen maybe, that's more short form. And it totally makes sense, and the internal logic is all there, but it being non-octave makes it so much harder to parse than any of those other things. And I think he's really, like, tapped into that sort of aesthetic in a way that nobody else has.
Yeah, he lives there. It's really obvious that he lives there when you listen to his music, and that's interesting. There's like my experience is that a lot of this kind of music, you really have to jump into it and not look back. I remember when I was doing the 31 Days project, that was like a big thing. And I still, for a little while, continued to write non-microtonal music for a couple years after that. And it's only about a year ago.
Blasphemy.
I know, about a year ago, I said, like, I'm done with this. Like, the only exception is if someone's going to just pay me a lot of money, then I'll do it because I like money. But the...
Good idea.
And unfortunately, money is a thing we all have to deal with. But we don't need to get into a money podcast, but if we want to do a money podcast, we could talk about that as well.
If we got into being a money podcast, then people would pay us money to make more money.
Oof, yeah,
I think they would pay us in cents.
Yeah, that's
only pay us one octave.
Yeah. But yeah, so that would be the only reason I would do something else for back, is if someone's like, oh, we got this thing and we're going to give you a lot of money to do it, because then it's kind of like it's really a non-choice at that point. But otherwise, I'm just kind of done doing this non-microtonal stuff. I mean, I live in the just intonation world, and I haven't explored many things with EDOs, but I'm not adverse to that. It's just the opportunities haven't sort of come up, and I appreciate the sort of the technical problems that human beings as instrumentalists are facing when they deal with these equal temperaments. Mercury Tree and Brendan Burns and all those guys working in equal temperaments, where they're like, well, we're just gonna like find these ways to like hack through all these different sounds.
We're just literally going to create instruments in all of these tunings, come up with musical language that sounds absolutely perfect, and then make the music. And for most people, they just have to do that last part.
Yeah, and it's interesting is, that's super like the spirit of Harry Partch, which is great, because he had that same problem. He was just moving into sort of like just intonation. He was like envisioning his own sort of mission at that point. But it's so great because, working mostly with computers, it's not a big deal for me to like have like, oh yeah, all the intervals are going to be just. That's not a huge problem for me to solve. Like, software developers have solved a lot of the issues for me about how to make that work. And when all these people are doing live performances, it's great. They're like, they want to pull these new sounds out, and they've got to like, well, these different equal temperaments have given me opportunities to like find different sounds and go in a lot of different directions that are really interesting. And then people who are working in electronic music in equal temperament is really interesting as well, because there the temperament itself is a timbral choice.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting exploration there, is a kind of liberation of sound in a way that is very much in the spirit of kind of how at least the Western tradition of music has been developing in the last 100 years, is really letting the different parts of music be less dependent upon one another, as a situation where when we think of Western classical music, there's very much a relationship between the melody and the harmony that dictates what each other is allowed to do. And then going into a situation where you're looking at an equal temperament as a timbral choice, you're suddenly like liberating these things and allowing them to sort of float side by side in a way that's interesting for the experience as a listener. So you're kind of setting up a different structure and order.
Yeah.
Although I think some people really crave that melodic / harmonic marriage of ideas. And I almost wish that there was some sort of, like, coherent thing that we could teach that was similar to common practice period theory with some other tuning, you know? Like, maybe with, like, a just scale that would be pretty easy to learn, or, like, porcupine tuning or something. But yeah.
Do you mind? I'm not quite following you. If you want to expand on that, because that sounds super interesting, but I'm not quite sure what you're getting at there.
Oh, sure. Well, lots of people have tried to explain some regular temperaments along alternate rules. So what I mean by that is how, like, in the diatonic scale, you're taught that there are 3 minor chords and 3 major chords, and then, of course, there's 1 diminished chord, the fatal flaw. And that's sort of how it's constructed, and...
The fly in the soup.
Yeah. And I think the farthest that a lot of people have gotten in microtonality, in sort of constructing alternate rules with those tunings, are they can say what the things are, but there's no pattern of usage that dictates how they should be used, and people are now fond of coming up with their own patterns. So really, the common practice period theory is kind of the teaching of tradition so that we know how to reference the past. So I guess microtonal music theory in that sense wouldn't really hold the same weight, because if we were describing how things interact with each other, lots of people think that we should be describing, like, how good they would sound together and how they would be used functionally. Maybe that can be part of it, but probably a big description of it is, about past usage. Because, like, composers, I don't think a lot of them are very interested in just using the rules of the common practice period, although they can reference that intelligently with the knowledge that they've learned. Yeah, I guess what I'm talking about is like how the diatonic scale is taught in school, but with just some other, like, temperament, like porcupine, or Blackwood 10, or something like that. Blackwood 10 would be a really good one, since it has major and minor chords, and all of that.
I would say that my pushback on that is that method of teaching the diatonic scale in schools is really flawed, because
for a lot of
it
reasons.
seems super ahistorical. My big sort of gripe with what we call music theory and how it's taught in universities, at least in the United States, is that it's so harmony focused, and it needs to be more focused on the linear level and on counterpoint, and counterpoint's really taught as an afterthought. That was my experience in university.
That's actually true, yeah.
And they're not really teaching theory at all. They're teaching literacy, which is important. There's very little talk of theory. There's some, like, sort of vague ideas of, like, what theory is. And if we're going to think of theory as, like, oh, we want to actually try and explain what's happening, we're trying to explain our experience, we're trying to explain what the music gives us, then we're not doing that in a university.
Right.
And we're making very little effort to set that up in our students. I think that's a detriment to our students in that way. I think largely there's just a lack of critical listening that's, like, going on. I didn't mean to get on this soapbox of everything that's wrong with music schools, but I think to your point about, are there ways to approach this, about, like, how we approach the major scale, that's an interesting problem to try and solve. And it's interesting because there's so much scattering of where everything's very eclectic right now in music, and especially in the microtonal community. But so many of us are just really trying to hack our way through this, and it's messy, and it's super beautiful, because there's an attempt to really try and find something that's different and meaningful and real among all of us that are trying to do it. And at the same time, it's a lot of practitioners doing our best to stay in touch with each other about this and see what's out there. And different people have different levels of success with that, which is just the case when a lot of people put their minds to something. Do you guys have any good suggestions about what spots that I should be hitting on my show. I'd love to hear some ideas, and it's a challenge to keep it from getting stagnant. I can play if I wanted to do a Ben Johnston show, I could just do a Ben Johnston show for months, but I want to not do that.
I mean, I really like the blend of different compositions that you put on the show. I think that's a really strong attribute, and I definitely would like to see themes. And I know that you did it like a piano one already, but probably the more of those you do, the better, because then there's some sort of unifying thread. I know that microtonality is already a unifying thread, but you and I both know that, there are a bunch of people who just don't consider that legitimate or something. At least that's how I feel. I feel like I'm always having to avoid saying the M word. So.
Oh, yeah. I have some. It's interesting.
Even experimental people.
Yeah. Most people don't realize, especially classical musicians, they don't realize they're doing this already.
Right. So they don't think
funny.
that it's, yeah. And it has to do with like the ear training and how things are framed, because like, I know that like before I got into microtonality, I know that like in choir, I was tuning things to make them sound good and using little differences, but I was never thinking like in terms of sense and stuff like that. And then when I learned just intonation and sort of like tried to do perfect pitch and other equal tunings, I became better at noticing those differences in a way I could articulate. And it's more like before I was just sort of making everything come together. So that first stage is sort of, really important to acquire in good tuning musicianship, and most musicians already have that. They just don't know how to describe it because there's not really very much practical reason for them to do so yet.
Oh, yeah. Do you mind, you said you had some friends who do barbershop. I wonder if I know them, because it's a fairly small community across the country.
My friend Greg Emanuel is really into it, and Instant Classic, if you know them, they are primarily based in Indiana, and so I went to Ball State like with Cole, and I've seen them perform a lot of times and stuff like that.
Like they say in every song, if it's true, that's where I belong. Is it true what they say about Dixie? Does the sun really shine all the time? Do the sweet magnolias blossom at everybody's door? Do folks keep eating possum till they can't eat no more? Is it true?
Oh, yeah, they're my old roommate in New York. He's like really close friends with that quartet, and I remember they do a lot of really interesting stuff, especially because all of them are arrangers, which is weird for a barbershop quartet.
Force.
It's really stuff, and Cole often makes the learning tracks for Voices of Gotham, because a lot of our guys don't read music. The bass in my quartet cannot read music at all.
That's interesting.
Like, zero. He has a vague sense of things going higher and lower, and he can read the words on the page. And it's kind of funny because like there's times in rehearsal where he'll like take his phone out or take his sheet music out, and part of me is like, what are you even looking at?
Right.
And it's just like, I have no problem with him not reading music, because he can sing good, and he's been doing it. Like his dad was a barbershopper, so he's grown up his whole life into it. So he knows like way more about it than me on an intuitive sense. And there's a really fun practice that we do sometimes, where four guys will just go into like a corner somewhere and just try and like create an arrangement by ear. Like you find like a melody that we all know, and then we just try and like harmonize a full like arrangement out at that time. And and that's like a thing. And everyone has to like know the style and be really sort of intuitive in their sense. And the guy who sings bass in my quartet, he's like so good at that, because he's born and bred that. But yeah, Cole does learning tracks for our chorus very often, where like he'll sing all four parts, and then you get those like part tracks out and give it out, and people use that for learning. And I use them even though I can read music, because it's just so much faster to learn to just hear the part like plunked right into my ear on the
Right.
on headphones.
Yeah.
Instant Classic is a really great quartet, and I
They're
remember
so
them.
good.
I remember
Yeah.
when they won in 2015. That was like they just sort of blew everyone out, because that was an interesting year where they were surprised because they jumped a lot of places, because the previous year they got like 10th or 8th, 9th place at the bottom, and then they just like jumped and came in, and it was pretty clear after the second round that they were definitely going to do something. And what's funny is actually that year, in the final round, they premiered a chart, and it was an arrangement of the same song that Voices of Gotham sang that year. And the song had never been done in the barbershop style before. And then coincidentally, like, here's two groups doing the same song in the same year. And we knew that was going to happen because their tenor, Dave, ended up seeing us do like a performance of that, like a test performance somewhere. And he's like, hey guys, just so you know, we're planning on doing this song too.
Oh my God.
And we're kind of like, oh God, you got to be kidding me. And they're like, don't worry, we're doing it on Saturday, so you guys will have the thing. Because we sang on Friday that week, and they did that situation. So that was a really interesting experience. And they just killed it. I think that was Theo's arrangement of How Could I Ever Know. It sounds like a Theo arrangement, because they all have different sort of arranging styles. And
I think that is. Yeah, he was talking about it. He actually teaches at Ball State. He's like a choral guy.
Oh, that's fantastic.
But oh, sure as you breathe, I am there beside you. Could I ever know? All I need is just one more moment. All you had asked was never to leave. If you could go with me, safe I would keep you.
Yeah, he's
Awesome. Yeah.
his arranging chops are really an interesting place. He brings a different sensibility to charts that other arrangers do. That it's great to hear his charts. I'll just say that.
I also know the Newfangled Four. They were at barbershop camp when I went.
Oh yeah, they're great. I know them from when I was in Southern California. So
Yeah.
actually, all of them except Ryan, we all sang in Masters of Harmony in 2011 when we won a championship.
I have a funny Newfangled Four anecdote, actually.
Do it.
They were playing like a chord that comes near to the end of some song that we were learning. And they were playing a G flat on the piano. And the G flat that we were singing was clearly a lot lower, because it was the 7/4 G flat.
Mm-hmm.
So I sort of asked him to check it, but the way I framed it was that the G flat that was on the piano and the G flat that we were singing were actually different notes.
It's more than a little bit higher. That one is
Right, exactly.
super noticeable. Like, that's one of those things that like kind of anyone can notice. There's something about the equal temperament of the piano that's also directly connected to the timbre. So even if you're playing pure intervals on a piano, it sounds wrong or it sounds out of tune until your mind switches. So I think a great lesson I've learned from delving into microtonality is that like timbre and pitch are not these separate domains that are independent from one another. They're actually really connected, and
they interact a lot.
There's sort of a confusing relationship, because at the same time you can make separate choices about those, but they affect one another. So they're both connected yet separate. It's a very confusing relationship to parse out, and you just got to deal with it.
Has anyone ever done a piece in Bull and Pierce where they try and not only use the tritave as sounding equivalent, but then they also try and intersperse it with a note, that same note going down by a perfect fifth, and kind of like making it sound like an octave higher, making it sound like so do as well as a tritave equivalence with timbre tricks. I've wanted to.
I don't know.
Try and do that.
I don't know.
I think
That'd be an interesting. Are you talking about like both like an O tonal and a U tonal, like tritave at the same time?
Yeah. Sort of. Like a situation where, if you had C as your main note in Bowl and Pierce, I guess if you notate another C, then it's going to be an octave and a perfect fifth higher, and then another C down is going to be an octave and a perfect fifth lower.
Yeah.
So one use for that octave and a perfect fifth is that you can make it try and sound equivalent, and I think you can get a weak sense of that. Like in the one thing that I've written in Bowl and Pierce, I think I succeed in getting the tritave to sound equivalent pretty easily, and it's very hearable, but the context is very specific. And so the other use I'm interested in is from C down to a lower C in Bowl and Pierce, so an octave and a perfect fifth. This first C can sort of sound like, so, and then the bottom one can sound like do. Or maybe what I actually should do is have the higher one sound like do and the bottom one sounds like fa, but sort of make the timbre funny in such a way that the low one doesn't really sound like it's an octave and a fifth lower, but just a fifth lower. It might be possible to do that.
Yeah.
So then some really interesting things could happen. If you, massively change the spectra of lots of pitches in Bowl and Pierce, you could get some really, really bizarre aural illusions. Which, Bowl and Pierce itself is already, very, very Xen harmonic by its very nature.
Yeah.
But
that'd be an interesting. Then it feels like then you've got these polytonalities occurring simultaneously. So
yeah, potentially.
That's my mind is a little bit on fire right now when you by bringing that up. Whoa, yeah. That's an interesting thing to think about. Wow, it's a lot of pitch space.
Yeah, you could also write in Bowl and Pierce using just things from JI, which is another good thing about JI, so you can do that. Of course, unless you're using the equal tempered version.
Yeah,
but
I mean, there's my understanding of Bowl and Pierce is that you have this tritave as the thing as opposed to the octave, and you just sort of work within that space as best as you can. But I think you'd have to avoid. You'd have to really do to avoid the actual 2/1 sound. You'd have to not have that in there. Otherwise, it's going to assert itself so much.
Yeah, it is.
That's the thing why I respect Löis's music so much, is because he makes it work really well, and it's already a mind-boggling affair to even begin approaching. But he does it. He makes it happen. So I have a few of his tracks in the queue that'll be coming down the line. I'm looking forward to doing that. I was listening to one of my upcoming shows on the subway the other day to just go through the playlist in my head and think about it. It's part of it's figuring out where I'm going to talk during the show.
Right. Yeah.
And sometimes it's in really surprising places, because sometimes the tracks go so well into one another that you shouldn't talk. Sometimes the tracks don't do that, and then sometimes you have to remember that people put way too much silence at the end of tracks. So that's an interesting thing. I keep remembering that I have to do these little notes to myself. I was there's 10 seconds of silence after this track. And I'm thinking why did you do that? Why would you do something like that? And it's not even getting super quiet. That would be fine if it's just it just gets really quiet, but it doesn't do that in this one. So it's that's a good spot to bring it down and do a little talking. And I do my radio voice for that. It's welcome to Xen Radio. This is Jude.
Close miking.
Yeah. And then the best classical DJ you possibly can be. But it's a lot of fun doing the show. It's interesting because so much of us who know about this are avid consumers of the style and all kinds of styles. So what I hope for the show in a lot of ways is not so much there's the two big hopes. I feel there's one where it's really more of a traditional radio situation where maybe someone is at their job and they can just turn it on and like listen to an assortment of tracks without having to think about like, what do I want to listen to? What's going on? But and then the other hope is that it's a place where people who want to learn more about this kind of music can go, because so much of us know about these kinds of music, and this music's super available, Bandcamp and a lot of outlets, that if you want to listen to an Elaine Walker track, you just go do it.
Right.
You don't have to like hope for those songs to come onto the radio to do that. And we all know about this music, but it's also like for people who don't know about this music, they could hopefully come to the show and learn new places to go and think like, oh, I can just listen to this and I'll have a list of artists that I can then explore. Because, KPISS doesn't have like a super huge audience. I get an average of about somewhere between like 5 and 15 listeners who are listening live at a particular show, which is pretty good.
Right.
But, and 15 is like a lot for any show on KPISS to have listening live. And all of our shows are archived on our website. So you can just go to the website and listen to any of the shows. But it's a good spot for if someone's just getting into this kind of music. They can go and have all these like playlists that exist with the artists, with the tracks. They can get a sense of where they might want to take their own listening habits at that point.
Yeah. I think it's really important that we do more than just make this kind of music, but that there are people out there who take a kind of curatorial role in finding, the interesting little nuggets to share with others that maybe coming into this with fresh ears. But it's a difficult thing to do, isn't it? Because when you're in that position, you're the one that has to say yes. You're the one that says no. You make the judgments. So, yeah.
Yeah, you got to be okay with that too.
Yeah.
I'm also spending the time, or whomever curates is giving up their time to curate. Yeah. So I respect that, and each of us have a choice about whether they want to listen or not. I agree that there's a lot of issues with access. So it's not like people who might dislike my show or might dislike any particular show, they don't have the ability to easily like just create their own show because of the realities of the world. And there's a lot more to say about that we don't need to get into, but and that's a shame that access isn't there, because I think that'd be really cool if it was, and we'd have an opportunity for more viewpoints around this. But at the same time, I am the one spending the time to curate, so I do have to make those decisions. One of the things, if there were more shows doing this, then it would actually make my role easier, because I could sort of stake out a genre zone and really focus more of my attention to that right now. And that's not a complaint or anything, because I like being challenged to expand my own horizons in this way, which is why I love when people send me emails and send me like Facebook messages and all kinds of things, like pushing themselves and be like, oh, here's my tracks, you should listen to my stuff, I'd love to get on your show. That's super exciting, and I listen to everything people send me. So I definitely encourage people to keep doing that. And it may take a few months to get on there, but like I do listen to everything people send me. Like I take that time to do that, but it may take me a few weeks to take a listen to what gets sent. And I love getting suggestions, because it makes my job easier.
You heard it from the man himself, everybody. He listens to your songs.
Yeah.
He's not something corporate. He's gonna take the time to do it.
I will do that. Yeah. It may be a while. So, I mean, both of you guys have had tracks on my show, so it's been exciting. Sevish, you have a lot of albums, so that's kind of the challenge there, and you've had actually a little more play than most people, so I wouldn't expect to hear you again anytime soon, because it's been weighted pretty heavily, but
Yeah. I know. I noticed that in the first couple of episodes, but yeah, I really appreciate being played as well because I don't often get the opportunity to have that. So.
Yeah, of course. And Stephen, I did one of your macrotonal etudes a while ago, which was, I think it was the Grave.
The 8-note one.
Yeah, it was really interesting.
Wow.
So
that's the one I would least expect to be on there. Which is interesting.
It was more about the particular show.
Yeah.
Because
it had one of the microtonal etudes on there too, right?
I think it may have. Easley Blackwood's microtonal etude was the infamous first track ever played on Xen Radio. I forgot which one it was, but I think it was the first one.
Yes.
But I did have one of yours a while ago. I think I have a couple of those more planned for the near future, but I'm just trying to figure out where those are going to go again, because it's so much about the balance about other things that makes it work. It can be really challenging sometimes, but I like that challenge because I get to listen to a lot of cool things because of it.
It seems like it would be difficult to blend so many different genres together seamlessly in a radio show, but I think you do that pretty well.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's less of a problem than one might think. Like at first I feel like, oh yeah, it's going to be weird, and then I listened to it and I was like, no, that actually sort of connects, and there's a lot that helps that. Yeah, I had you back on back in late April. That was a good episode because I got away from doing a lot of like classical. I think you were. I'm gonna say you were the one classical track on there. I think maybe with the Carter Schultz as well from the Almost Square. But otherwise, that was like a lot of ambient and then Tolgahan and a couple things. I try to do like a show has like a few, like 2 or 3 tracks by one artist, so there's a little bit of connection there. But I've learned that doing more than 5 tracks by one artist violates the licensing thing, so then the streaming doesn't work after that. And I was a big bummer because I did that episode with
John Schneider?
Yeah, the John Schneider and Milici.
Yeah.
And I remember putting so much effort into like planning that show.
And then
it's not available for listening in the United States, at least. So like if you go to be like, oh, you violated the license agreement for Mixcloud. And I was like, oh, you got to be kidding me. And I tried all these ways to like trick out the detection algorithms, but it recognizes the songs like in there. So so it's sort of like, because that was like, I remember like listening to that whole album, which I actually found off Sevish from your giant playlist, Spotify playlist.
Oh, the Melise one.
Yeah, Melise. Is that how it's said? I
think it's Melise. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's actually really, really interesting. I think a lot of that album was made by connecting some electrode or something to plants.
Yeah, it's it's such a beautiful work, that whole album.
Yeah.
And it was like I spent a lot of time listening to that and like figuring out, because I was thinking when I found it, I was like, oh, okay, I'll feature some tracks from this. And this is one of those where it's like, I kind of want to have this be like the centerpiece of an episode. And realizing that it, I still had about, I think, 25 minutes to fill up or something, or like 20 minutes, and then finding the John Schneider Tombeau pour Lou that he did for his Just National Steel album that came out earlier this year was a really good. There was a few things on that album that worked really well with that, but it was just finding exactly the right kind of balance. And that was a good show where I didn't have to talk at all, where I just came on and said, this is what we're listening to this week. I'm not going to say anything at all because I just want it to go through. So unfortunately, the licensing, I don't know how it works outside of the United States, but if you're in the United States, it's difficult to listen to that. But both of those albums are widely available, so anyone can go grab the playlist and just do that. And if you're on Apple Music, I share my profile on all the playlists on Apple Music. So for anyone who's on Apple Music, they can go search Composer Jude and they'll see all the playlists for the shows. Unfortunately, some of the things that I have to get off Bandcamp are not on there if they're not available on Apple Music. And that does end up being around one track per episode. I'm surprised actually at the availability of things on Apple Music, because it's great. It's actually really good. It's a pleasant surprise. It's only about one album per show do I have to like go on to Bandcamp, and it's great that all I have to do is go to Bandcamp and then go get the album off of Bandcamp.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Yeah,
there's like I imagine doing this show without these tools would be just really hard without the support of like a major radio station or media company, to the point where people are like, sending you demo material to make sure like, oh, please play this on our show. I encourage everyone to go listen to both those works, because they're really interesting works, and they complement each other in a pretty great way that I had a lot of fun doing. One thing I'd like to do more of in the future is have more guests on the show and have guest curators come on and do that. So I might approach both of you at some point in the near future about talking about doing a playlist for the show and then talking about those sorts of things. But there's logistical challenges. If you're ever in New York, let me know.
Yes.
And then it becomes super easy, because then we just sit in the studio and do it.
Yes.
And but do that. And so, and any microtonalists in New York, you should, if you're listening, send me a message.
All right. Well, that has been our Now in Zen episode with Jude Thomas. Thanks so much, Jude.
Yeah, thank you.
Love to have you on.
My pleasure.
Please listen to all of his compositions in Xen Radio. And if you want to help the podcast out, you can leave us a review on iTunes, and spread the word to all your friends, of course, especially musicians and people who you think would be interested. We generally release new episodes every month on the 12th. Subscribe so you won't miss any episodes. We're available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, or you can find our RSS feed at nowinzen.libsyn.com. Thanks everybody listening. Adios. We'll see you later.
All right.
Okay.
Good to have you on the show.
Okay.